Amy, thank you for having me, and it's quite amazing to keep anything growing and alive like this forum for 8 years. So Amy kind of kicked us off with a very modest goal for our 3 days. We're supposed to transform our food and energy system, restore nature, and revitalize our community. And as an educator and as a fund manager, I'd have to say that the resounding message that we've had throughout this session is that we are now, I think, fully aware of the magnitude of the problem. And so one of the things that I've been spending a lot of my time on is thinking about this issue of scaling and the issue of transition. Okay, we understand we have a huge problem, but what does that mean to scale that? And I find that we oftentimes use very fancy words, maybe because it makes us feel like a big shot, like planetary scale, transformation of systems, and especially when entrepreneurs are pitching. And I find that we work with land a lot in our fund, and I have a hard time understanding the magnitude of that scale and what that even feels like. I had the, I guess, good fortune during COVID of spending 14 days in quarantine to get into Singapore. This was 2020. And so you can only work so much. And so I ended up turning on Netflix. And I had an opportunity to watch, and I don't know how many of you have seen this movie, the David Attenborough 2020 movie, A Life on the Planet. All right? And I tend to think of that movie in a very different way. It's not as usual documentary. I almost feel like that is a memoir. I was going to say eulogy, but memoir to himself about what he has seen and accomplished. And I think it's a particularly poignant movie. But one of the things that I deeply appreciated about that movie is that he used a very old-fashioned railway sign that, you know, the numbers flip and the letters flip. And he used that analogy throughout. The movie follows, the documentary follows his life from his first documentary to today. And every periodic moment within that movie, the scoreboard flips. And he flips it with the population of the world. It flips with the CO2 content of our air. It flips to the percentage of the planet that is remaining in the wild. And for me, that was an incredibly powerful, sort of visceral response to watch this, the backdrop of the numbers. And two things really struck home to me. One is that as a species, we have been incredibly effective at destroying. And it just, when you take milestone of his life to milestone of his life, and the numbers flip and they accelerate, you get this incredible sense of movement. The second thing that I came away with was the degree of destruction that we did also represented hundreds of thousands of families or people that were hired to do this level of destruction. I think of it as 100,000 men that got up for 40, 50 years every day to drive a D5, D7 Caterpillar and knock down trees. 100,000 fishing boats out, or 1 million fishing boats out every day to harvest the ocean in order to actually get to where we are. That brought home these numbers in a very visceral sense. One is magnitude and effectiveness, but two is how many people were involved in this enterprise. And they were paid to do it. To bring it home, and we use these terms, planetary scale. The Amazon is on the order of 100, the amount of the Amazon that's been burned is on the order of 175 million acres. What does it mean to reforest that? At 400 trees per acre, that means 70 billion trees. All right. Palm oil, we've talked a lot about that. we've protested, we've boycotted. That represents about 60 million acres of rainforest. That represents about 20 billion trees that we would have to plant. I want you to put this in perspective. The largest plant nursery in the United States is Weyerhaeuser at 150 million trees a year. Reforestation, nursery, magnitude. Probably most poignant of all is last year we all saw on the evening news the Canadian forest fires. And we saw that Canada burned and burned and burned. And it's estimated now that 40 million acres of Canada burned. In an average normal year, about 5.5 million acres of Canada burns. That's 8 times more than is a normal, stochastically, over the last decades. That represents 16 billion trees to replace that. Now, as an investor, you have to step back and ask, well, what's it going to take to scale something of this magnitude? And there's some unique challenges, and that is that when we talk about repair, restoration, and transformation, or adaptation at this scale, we need to recognize that most of the things that we're talking about are infrastructure. I jokingly call this the Maslow hierarchy of needs, all right? The things that we will need to do to repair climate and repair the damage are the Maslow hierarchy of needs: food, water, shelter, clothing, energy, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with these sectors to repair them, and particularly unique, is that they're commodities. And that means thin margins and massive scale in order to repair them. And that, in and of itself, creates some unique challenges in what we're trying to do. But when it works, it's a miracle. So if you step back, in the last 20 years, and I don't understand why we don't actually make much more celebration about this. In the last 20 years, the largest economy in the world, us, we have implemented 25% of our total nation's energy generation, electrical energy generation, in the form of renewables. Think about that. The world's largest economy within 20 years got to 25%. Just as remarkable, in the last 20 years, China has achieved 30%. So as much as we talk about their coal, we have to talk about, on balance, what they've done. So when you align the forces, and what forces are those, miracles can happen. It's got to make economic sense, got to have enough technology, it works well enough, we have to have a customer for the outcome. In this case, renewable energy. And they have to make long-term commitments, so also known as an offtake made by utilities. And then the next part that needed to come together, and it doesn't get credit for the innovation, was the fact that the regulations and incentives became usable economic tools when a bunch of finance folks figured out how to take advantage of the incentives and the regulations, and they started to match the right forms of capital in the stack, and then they took advantage, in fact, on the lack of familiarity with renewables at the time, and generated the kind of returns that then catalyzed the growth of the market that ended up where we are today at 25% renewables. They created the time for the technology to catch up. So the question then is, if we're going to try to solve problems like what I articulated of the scale of the Amazon, the reforestation, these huge, huge things that are literally going to take decades to do because they took decades to destroy, these pieces have to come together. We're an infrastructure investor in food and biofuels. So it really goes to what Amy set out as a challenge. And as I said earlier, most of these sectors involved in climate solutions are commodity markets that have commodity margins and are CapEx and operationally intensive. And specifically, this represents an incredible challenge in scaling because there are no excess margins and the growth is roughly linear to the production capacity. which are really words that are the opposite of what every venture capitalist wants to hear. All right. And so I wanted to, lastly, maybe just share a few lessons learned after investing about $1.5 billion over the last 7-8 years in controlled environment agriculture infrastructure to be climate adaptation infrastructure, as well as in energy transition. And it's kind of a practical playbook. And it's one that I think we're going to have to take to heart as we think about scaling commodity-based infrastructure industries. Number one, no matter how much tech inside, and I'll use the controlled environment as a proxy learning environment, no matter how much tech inside, controlled environment greenhouse produce is still a commodity that competes with field-grown incumbents with commodity prices and margins that follow supply-demand behavior and are without tech margins or tech leverage and scaling. That's what we're challenged with. So agriculture, we know, is going to have to increasingly become climate adaptive because you can't move a hunk of land. And if everything that was talked about in the previous 2 presentations is true, we're going to have to then build this kind of infrastructure. So what are the implications of that? If you're in a thin commodity industry, it means that you can only move so fast. The fact you need to fill the factory before you build the next one. And the Silicon Valley strategy of it's a land grab just doesn't work when you're building these massive, expensive pieces of infrastructure. So you can't go that fast. Get the unit economics and process stable before you innovate. Remember another high-tech Silicon Valley term, fail fast? These are process-intensive applications. Oftentimes they involve nature, they involve economic systems, they involve tech. You can only innovate once you've got it stable, which again speaks to the speed that you can actually move. Operate with minimal corporate overhead and be on the ground, not in the headquarters. These are tactical things. All these things that we're talking about, nature-based solutions, et cetera, you can't do that from Wall Street. You have to be on the ground to actually resolve and solve these kinds of problems. Again, the antithesis of many of the ways that we want to invest. After your first project, look at the complete system and the ways it's divided to create a community of solutions. Start asking the question, the answer to these big infrastructure problems, how much of it is centralized, how much of it is distributed, and how much of it is actually shared infrastructure? And the reason you ask that question is because you're going to try to ascertain the risk profile in each one of those parts. And then the most important thing, ask what form of capital is best suited to that part of the solution. Said another way, using venture capital to solve some of these problems is an awful way of building roads, bridges, infrastructure. And so getting smart on the kind of capital that's required for each of these parts is actually one of the keys to success. And the last thing is take the time then to build the ecosystem of jobs, skills, and providers that are necessary to scale. I think the optimism, you can get really depressed by the scale of 175 million acres of the Amazon burned over the last 50 years. 60 billion trees will have to be planted. It's a scary thing. But as we can see from renewables, if we take the time to go slow, to go fast, align the players, the changes, the financing, the players, case examples and miracles like the renewables can in fact happen. And many of these things are just a very different way of thinking about the challenge of repairing the scale of damage is going to take equally the amount of mental horsepower and creativity in order to harness the resources necessary to repair it. There are going to be no easy answers, but when they do happen and the alignment happens, we get what happened in renewables. Thank you very much.